Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's conference call. This is a TS Lombard conference call. For those of you who may not be aware, TS Lombard is the new merged company that is the result of a merger between Lombard Street Research and Trusted Sources. And my name is Nick Bourne. I'm a managing director at TS Lombard. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the call today and to be able to introduce Christopher Granville, who's your speaker today, and we'll be talking and answering your questions on rising political risks and what we see as the increasing likelihood of military tension as a result of Donald Trump and his approach to negotiation, if you want to think of it like that. He'll be attempting to provide a framework to analyze what's been going on and tell you all what that means for asset prices. We want the call to be interactive. We encourage you to ask questions. There's an email address to send them to, which is questions@tslombard.com. That's questions@tslombard.com. So please send them to that address. We'll deal with as many as we can during the call. Those that we don't get to on the call, we'll reply to after the event. There's a small chart pack for the call, which if you haven't received it, send an email to the same address immediately. That's questions@tslombard.com, and Martin Chapman will send you the chart pack straight away. So thanks very much for joining us today, Christopher. I just want to run through the themes that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be talking about the escalation of the risk of military tension with China arising from Trump's negotiating style. We're going to talk about the parts of the Chinese political interest that are non-negotiable and therefore problematic for any potential deal making. We're going to be talking about potential flashpoints where Trump may be reactive rather than proactive, such as North Korea. We're going to talk about a dramatic change to the US foreign policy regarding the Middle East, and we're going to talk about Eurasia and Russia as an area where perhaps there's less risk. The title of your note, Global Political Drivers, last week was Trump's Path to War, which is a very dramatic title. It sounds very dramatic, or have I missed something in the thrust of your assessment?
I think, Nick, the only thing I would say straight away is that with a new US president coming into office and starting a new term, for the purposes of political and above all geopolitical analysis, from a perspective of global economic and financial market risks, we would anyway want to do a checkup on the prospects, if any, of the incoming United States administration getting into international conflict situations. There is no more basic geopolitical risk than that, nothing more potent from the point of view of elevating risk aversion and ultimately being reflected in asset prices. Now, of course, if our quick check produced the answer that this was a non-question, for example, it might have done at the beginning of President Obama's first term in early 2009, and that would have been the right answer, incidentally, then we would pass straightly on, and we wouldn't have published, certainly not such a long research report with a clear conclusion, which, ladies and gentlemen on the call listening, if you had a chance to look at it, you'll have seen is that we think that the Trump administration's approach to international questions, in particular in China, is such that it should result in an increase in risk aversion. However, the first thing I should stress, perhaps, is that the most recent historical precedent for a U.S. president taking the U.S. to war was the administration of George W. Bush. I think we'll pass over the involvement of the Obama administration in the NATO campaign in Libya, largely because it was initiated by European powers, France and UK in particular, and secondly because Mr. Obama himself, in one of his valedictory interviews in Atlantic Monthly, described that as his worst foreign policy decision of his time as US president, and exemplifying his watchword of "don't do stupid shit." So we're looking at the George W. Bush presidency, and those of you, ladies and gentlemen, who have in front of you the couple of exhibits that were sent round, and the first one was actually in the report. I can refer to this right away.
Just a reminder here, if you haven't received the chart pack, send an email to questions@tslombard.com. Thank you.
So just to continue on that, in the exhibit you'll see a stylized comparison of George W. Bush with Donald Trump under two headings, substance and style. And the substance, I think, brings home, I think, the first insight, which is that, judging by his stated positions, President Trump is far from being in any way inclined to international conflict as a preferred instrument of policy. So to put it in more direct language, he's very far from being a warmonger. The whole logic of America First, the central slogan, is that the agenda is domestic economy, domestic jobs, and there is no sense of wanting to export democracy to the world. I'm thinking in particular of George W. Bush's inauguration address at his second inauguration in 2004, and January 2005 rather, and of course the Iraq War is a central exhibit. So regime change, international conflict, not an inherent part of the Trump agenda. So far, so good. But the reason why we see nevertheless material risks of tensions which could become military tensions stems rather from President Trump's style, where we do see certain similarities with the Bush administration, or at least the underlying similarity is that it gives grounds for concern. So perhaps I just get into that.
Please, I think, because this is central to the kind of, you're trying to build an analytical framework to help clients understand what so far has been confusing, not to say chaotic. So I think it's if you could spend some time elaborating on how you've come to construct this framework, that would be excellent.
Well, great. I guess that what I'm trying to achieve here is to get beyond simply some kind of opinion in the void, as a manner of speaking, just looking at what's going on, trying to apply experience and judgment, coming up with an opinion, trying to bring, as you just said, Nick, a little bit more structure. And the structure, I think, comes in the style, as I said, or the approach to the pursuit of international goals. As you mentioned in your introduction, negotiating approach. And the key feature of this is a mixing or a jumbling of different elements. Instead of traditional or conventional diplomacy, where questions and problems and disagreements are handled in compartments. So you have a disagreement with China on trade, you discuss with the Chinese on trade policy.
And the US Trade Department speaks for them.
Exactly, and all the arts of negotiation, the mixtures of carrot and stick, usual stuff, are deployed within that silo. But Donald Trump's approach is to mix in with that other bargaining chips from completely different areas, including the one which is related to, as I said at the beginning, the most powerful form of political risk imaginable, which is conflict and tension, including military tension, between powers, including great powers, including, in this case, nuclear armed powers. So we see that Donald Trump says that he won't recognize the one China policy, that is, or won't feel bound by it, that is Taiwan as part of China, or even Tibet, conceivably, unless he gets the deal he wants with China on trade. And perhaps the most delicate moment of all is the question of the South China Sea and China's claim to territorial sovereignty over pretty much all of that seaway, which is crucial to its international trade routes, and in particular the construction of artificial islands or reefs, the actual or potential militarization of those reefs, and so on. So this is clearly a potential flashpoint. And I would stress here on this structural argument that what we see is not so much using incidental bargaining chips. We've established that Trump doesn't seem particularly interested in regime change, in global hegemony as an end in itself, but bargaining chips. But if you come at it, instead of saying, well, I want something on trade, and I will actually give you a concession to sweeten what would still be a tough pill for you to swallow, to reduce your import tariffs on American goods, your tariff barriers. The question of currency manipulation, of course, is moot, because as I think the new administration will begin to say in public, we predict, as they get into their jobs, that the era of artificial depreciation of the Chinese currency, although clearly a major feature of the last couple of decades, is now over. But nevertheless, there are other serious trade issues, tough stuff. But if you offer a concession that America is ready to concede some sphere of influence to China, then of course you could have a deal. But instead of using the geopolitical bargaining chip as a carrot, there is a sense that they're coming into this as a stick. We think that China has not been dealing fair with the United States for a long time. We're going to get our own back, and we're going to deploy these various pressure points. And this is part of just feeling like softening up the opponent, right, or the counterparty would be perhaps a more neutral word, in advance of some negotiation. Now, using this type of incidental bargaining chip as a stick rather than a carrot, this is the structural point, creates the risk of that part of this jumbled up negotiation, that part, the dangerous part, building a momentum of its own. I guess that is the structural reason why we see why we think this risk is to be taken seriously. To go back to your first question, Nick, the dramatic sounding title of our research note published last week, why we wanted to really flag up to investors why we think this risk should be taken seriously. In fact, one question I've had in from one of our clients already refers to the opinion that the Trump administration is not respecting the principles of Sun Tzu's Art of War, the great ancient Chinese military strategist, by attacking on all fronts rather than choosing your point, being loud when you should be quiet, and so on. So, very much that type of client reaction is very much, I think, goes with the grain of our own analysis.
Okay, so the overarching framework here is that Trump, you don't read to be an aggressor or someone who is naturally looking to push US interests as he would see it abroad, but what
no intrinsic military agenda.
Right, and what he's looking to do is to get deals that suit his domestic agenda.
Yep.
And is going about it so far in a negotiating style, which means you think he'll end up trapped by circumstance, and that's where the risk of tension rising and the risk that we get into military tense situations. That's where it comes from. That's the framework.
Exactly. That's a good summary. And so perhaps I could just take it one step further. Since we published our note, there have been some reassuring signs, and they come from senior officials in the Trump administration, including the recently confirmed Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the Defense Secretary James Mattis, and the National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who in various ways have made clear that the administration is not planning to hurtle headlong into some confrontation with China, which might be militarized. Speaking in Tokyo in particular, I'm sure many of you ladies and gentlemen will have noticed this, Mattis said that we do not see any need for dramatic military moves at all, so no kind of US military build-up in the West Pacific, although it should be said that, of course, that the United States has very considerable military, especially naval assets there in any case, through its network of permanent bases. But nevertheless, the tone was much more conciliatory. Mattis called for diplomacy, as did Flynn, speaking with the most senior official in China, who with overall responsibility for foreign policy, Yang Jiechi. According to the Chinese side, at least, Flynn spoke of handling sensitive issues in a proper manner. And perhaps most importantly, Tillerson said directly in written answers to a US lawmaker, one of the most prominent foreign policy oriented, if I can put it that way, senators, Ben Cardin. Tillerson said that Taiwan should not be used as a bargaining chip. So in other words, there is clearly, from the most senior officials in the administration, a sense of the risks which I've just been describing in this approach. But where do we come out? Well, clearly this is, as in all political analysis, a large degree of judgment, which can only be measured against future evidence. The precision is by its definition is difficult to reach. But my judgment would be that this is reassuring to the extent that it shows that the administration, as it beds down, will be wanting to manage the Trump style. But I would be skeptical myself about whether they can actually change the inherent nature of that style. Therefore, I don't think that a couple of reassuring quotes from senior administration officials is sufficient for us to switch off this theme and say, put it to bed and say, we'll think about things we'd rather be thinking about. I think that investors should continue to be vigilant.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about some of the potential booby traps, if you like, some of the potential areas where tension may well rise, not through proactive aggression, but because of negotiating style and the type of situations you've described Trump and the US perhaps ending up in. Could we start, please, with the US and China? Clearly, the globally most significant relationship, the one that investors will be mostly concerned about. We've said in the invitation to the call there are certain areas which for China are absolutely non-negotiable, and this is where risk is created because Trump's negotiating style is saying that everything is up for grabs. Could you go into some detail there on what you think China is absolutely not willing to negotiate on?
Well, thanks for mentioning that, Nick, because I inadvertently left out that very important point when I was just running through a minute ago our sort of structural approach to analyzing these foreign policy risks coming out of the Trump administration. I did mention already that you have these bargaining chips in the geopolitical and potentially the military sphere, which can take on a momentum of their own. And you just put your finger on the additional key point, which I left out, which is that the bargaining chips in question, therefore by definition these are meant to be negotiating levers and tools, happen to be on questions of substance which for China are existential. I did mention in passing one China, Tibet, clearly and Taiwan, and also most dangerous, the South China Sea, because although Taiwan and Tibet are very difficult questions, they are kind of long-term and they've been embedded into the international system, whereas China's assertive policies in the South China Sea are of much more recent vintage. And if I can take you back to those written answers from Tillerson to the Maryland senator, although he's saying that the U.S. would only react by implication, the clear implication, only in some conflict situation would it want to blockade or interdict the controversial Chinese reefs or islands in the South China Sea. He also speaks of the need to accept risk if one is to deter further destabilizing actions. So there is clearly going to be continued pressure, not deployment, not a forward deployment of force, but continued pressure. And these are areas which for China, as I say, are existential. The waterway in question is perceived as by China as its lifeline to its external trade, and ultimately it's securing the raw materials and other inputs for its economy. So these are chips in areas which are not negotiable, and that of course further accentuates and heightens the degree of risk.
So any statements on either the Chinese side or the US side concerning the reefs and any potential movement of troops and so on in the area, that's something we're going to pay close attention to?
Well, absolutely. I think we wouldn't be talking about this topic if there wasn't a real possibility that one or either side could initiate some action. But remember that there's always the unintended consequences, the unpredictable actions, third parties. There are important countries around the South China Sea who are actually the direct counterparties of this dispute. Philippines, which has already won an international legal case in its favor, Vietnam, and other countries. So there could be actions or reactions which themselves could set off chains, forcing the principals, as it were, the US and China, to react. So because you have this combustible framework dictated by the structure of the Trump approach to foreign policy, one needs to be all the more attentive to what I think it was Donald Rumsfeld famously described as stuff happening.
Okay, and so what do you think? It's time to put your kind of a forecasting hat on here. What do you expect to happen in the West Pacific? What do you think the Trump administration is likely to do?
Well, I think in our note last week, we wanted to flag that this is a serious matter, and events could unfold in the opening months, if not weeks, I quote, if not weeks of the Trump administration. You heard me say a minute ago that I don't think that these more measured signals from senior administration officials in the last few days change the picture fundamentally, but they probably would shift our judgment a little bit that it's not weeks but months, because the way that this adversarial situation which Trump has set up with vis-a-vis China unfolds will be framed over a longer time scale. So I think that to that extent the timing factor becomes a little bit more relaxed, with the caveat that there might always be events that need to be reacted to, as just mentioned, but nevertheless the problem does not go away. So.
And one of the potential areas that might prompt a reaction is North Korea. Do you want to explain a little bit more about the thinking behind that?
Well, I think that's the most purely reactive situation, because I think that even in the most eye-catching, if I can put it that way, tweets by President Trump, there's never been any suggestion of a purely preemptive move of a military nature against North Korea, but clearly signals that the slightest new provocation by the North Korean dictator, of which there have been very many over the years, could be met by a massive massive response, which of course we can only infer might or almost certainly would have at least some military component. Mattis, the Defense Secretary, has pretty much said the same. So we are just in uncertainty there. I've got no original wisdom to offer you, ladies and gentlemen, which will take you much further than the general speculation which you can read about in any media or general commentary, except that I would want to highlight the China angle.
Right.
And here I'm drawing on the insights in particular of my colleague Jonathan Femby, who produces all our political analysis on China
from within the China in-depth
service. Many of you may know or met Jonathan or be familiar with his work in one or another way, and he always stresses that the inability of China and the US to collaborate effectively to meet what is a threat which they both perceive from North Korea comes from Chinese concerns that the United States is poised as a result of any final crisis or cathartic moment in North Korea to expand its US sphere of influence in China's immediate neighborhood. So, and we've seen this again. Mattis was in Seoul, announced, reaffirmed the intention to deploy missile defense technology and capabilities, including radar capabilities. And of course, this is clearly designed not to threaten China, but to defend against potential missile strikes from North Korea. But such capabilities could, in time, be developed in a way which would threaten China's strategic nuclear deterrent. It's a perfect example of that lack of trust or of making these the common interest into a real practical. So there would have to be very imaginative diplomacy to get over that. What I'm really saying is that that is, I think, the angle which at least you can get some analytical purchase on.
Right.
If you saw something happening there, then we could actually look for a more constructive cooperation between US and China on North Korean issue, rather than just sitting passively like the whole of the rest of the world, wondering what on earth might happen and how the key players, starting of course with President Trump himself, would react. So I just wanted to highlight that as something which I don't expect to be any movement on, but is as an important question, which in turn illustrates a wider question of spheres of influence and new geopolitical equilibria. It might take us on to some other geographies too.
It will. Thanks very much. So we've spent a lot of time on China already and touched on North Korea there. We'll come back to US-China at the end of the call. We've got some questions coming in on that. The address is questions@tslombard.com. But I think, Christopher, if you would like to spend a bit of time talking about other potential paths to conflict, and therefore other parts of the world. We've said that the Middle East is an area where Trump, as in many areas, has torn up existing policy and is going down a different route from the previous path. And also, you think that Russia, Eurasia is perhaps something where investors need to be slightly less concerned than other areas. Is that right?
That pretty much sums it up. I'll just spend a minute just elaborating on each of those.
Okay, I'll go into detail on why.
Let's start with the second. The Russia relationship, Western Eurasia. Well, that's a topical angle of media interest, of course, as regards President Trump and his administration. I guess that my very first point, I think, I made on the call, that the central Trump doctrine of America first is inherently unwarlike, you could say. Now, some of you, ladies and gentlemen, may have been thinking that you don't quite agree with that. I suggest that because I can assure you that there are many experts out there security experts, geopoliticians, not sure how to call them, who would not agree with me. They would say that America first can lead indirectly to conflict and war. They recall, for example, the historical precedent of America first, the isolationist movement in the 1930s, including public figures in the United States like Lindbergh, who were openly pro-Nazi and pro-Nazi Germany, against U.S. involvement in any war against Nazi Germany. And of course, the argument goes that the U.S. retreat, this isolationist America first tradition, can actually remove the deterrence, which ends up by making war more likely. And in that particular case, the central case of modern world history, if you like, of course, did happen. The contribution of American isolationism to the outbreak of the Second World War, we had better not get into, otherwise we'll be here all day. But in the fast forwarding up to the present, this school of thought runs that Trump's relative lack of interest in the historic United States alliance systems, among which NATO takes pride of place. Yes. NATO, the alliance which was formed in the first place to prevent Russia, then Soviet Russia under Stalin, when it started, taking over Europe, that he's less interested in that. This will encourage Russian revanchism and could lead indirectly to conflict risk.
But do we know that we don't know that he's not interested in NATO or doesn't see the value of NATO. So far, his policy on it is to get other people to pay their fair share, as he would see it, of the costs of NATO.
That's strictly speaking absolutely true. He's not. Well, in one of perhaps his most notorious single press interview with a couple of European newspapers 3 days before his inauguration, he did describe NATO as obsolete. But for the most part, you're right, Nick. It's just been saying that all members of NATO should pay their way. and that the United States would no longer be shouldering a disproportionate burden. But even if we just forget about the interview where he spoke of NATO as obsolete, yes, the implication of that position, although it kind of literally taken means sort of neutral, they're all in favor of NATO, just everyone must pay, there is a sense of that lack of commitment. Right. It's in the nature of defensive alliances and doctrines of deterrence that commitment and signaling is all.
And I suppose it backs up entirely your point on his negotiating style, which is, even if that's what he and the US authorities believe, they could have easily contacted governments below the radar without making public statements about this.
Well, absolutely so. But I've just actually spent a minute or two describing a point of view which I myself do not share. I think that this perspective is, in a way, obsolete. It harks back to the post-Second World War confrontation between the United States and the Western European allies with Soviet Russia, and underestimates the new reality, which is more that the old geopolitical fault line, which runs down the western border of what used to be the Russian Empire, is one that just needs to be kept as a neutral buffer. It's no longer, I think, a territory where either side, very much including Russia, wants to conquer and subjugate, unless it felt an active risk of military threat on its border and invasion, which is why the enlargement of NATO, and we actually went through this line of argument in some detail in the previous publication in our Global Political Drivers series, which clients can find there on our site. We described the enlargement of NATO as the root cause of these tensions, and that the Trump position is inherently, therefore, will have inclined to make those tensions subside. Right. Now, how far we get towards a stable equilibrium of lower risk is an interesting discussion, which perhaps again we won't get into now at length unless there are further questions on that. But our view would be that set of risks is in many quarters overstated, and we see a good chance of reduced risk premiums. The only one that really matters is for the rather parochial case of Russian financial assets. This whole geopolitical confrontation with Russia has not really moved wider markets, perhaps a tiny margin. It's affected German growth, but it's been dissolved in so many other factors that unless you're an equity investor looking at certain Polish, Hungarian and German companies, you wouldn't have been much concerned with this geopolitical risk factor. But the other one you mentioned, Nick, the Middle East, is much more serious, because to some extent the Middle East arena constitutes the exception to our rule that Trump is in general inward focused, not seeking out international tension and some agenda as a core goal, as opposed to an instrument or a tool or a bargaining chip. I think the Middle East is potentially an exception because of two things. First, an initiative to change what has been another historic United States foreign policy position, which is to support the so-called two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is not yet explicit, but it's implicit in appointing a new U.S. ambassador to Israel who favors moving the United States Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And it's also been evident in support from the Trump team for Israel's settlements policy, although they've rowed back a little bit from that now and not supporting yet more settlements being built on the West Bank, which is meant to be the part of the territory of the Palestinian state. But along with this change of policy on Israel is a very hostile stance towards Iran, which has no real logic which can be detected in relation to Trump's core agenda. Right. One can only speculate about what's driving it. It could be just a reaction against the Obama administration. All its works are bad and bad deals, as Trump said in his notorious phone conversation the other day with the Australian Prime Minister, for example. It could also be a reflection of the personal experience of his National Security Advisor, General Flynn, on the ground in the Iraq War, and suffering casualties from Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq. One can speculate about the causes of this, but it is a kind of forward policy of wanting to weaken Iran, and we've already seen that expressed in a ratcheting up of sanctions in response to an Iranian ballistic missile test, and those two things could come together in a combustible way. If the Israel-Palestine conflict were to be reignited in one of its sadly periodic episodes in Gaza Strip or even on the West Bank or some mixture of the two, the involvement of the main Iranian proxy there, the Hezbollah, and in our work on the Middle Eastern arena in our Global Political Drivers series, we've been very much stressing the risks generated by the interlocking proxy wars going on there, and the way that proxies are often the tail that wags the dog. They're not under full control of their sponsors and masters. So Hezbollah's involvement in any potential new violence in and around Israel could result in a US retaliation against Iran. These are, I think, very real dangers, which again should be closely watched.
Well, thanks very much. We've got a few minutes left to go. The question, the perennial question that comes in, which analysts seem to dread sometimes, is of course the one about the probabilities of these various scenarios that you've been describing. It's clear that you're not expecting them to occur triggered by the US, apart from in the case of Iran and the Middle East, where there's a possibility that the US is an actor rather than a reactor. But in terms of the US, China in particular, what do you think the probability or the likelihood is there that that Trump does get trapped by the rhetoric and therefore things escalate out of control?
Well, I would want to, first, I hope I'm not going to come across as the analyst who is worse than the politician in the sense of dodging the question or ducking it. But I would want to define the question not as will there be all-out arms conflict between major great powers. I think that's a fool's errand. But to define the question as military tensions. I think my answer would be that we wouldn't be writing about this, speaking about this at all, if we didn't see it as a 50-50 chance. I mean, if it was more like some tail risk, then I think we wouldn't be bidding for your time, ladies and gentlemen. It's some build-up of military tensions in these two regions, South China Sea and the Middle East, but obviously the South China Sea is far the more potent driver of global risk aversion, and is a toss-up. It could easily happen. You heard me being a little bit more relaxed about the timing of these tensions building up, but I would say that it's at least a 50-50 chance that we get some military tensions, and then people will look at the logic, will look at all the points I've been making, the way that this Trump approach is structured, yes, allowing such tensions to develop a momentum of their own, and of course the possibility of discounting further. So if I can just illustrate this very briefly with one concrete example, the Obama administration, you may be recalled, did send, from memory, 2 warships through those, I think straits is not quite the word, the narrowest part of the South China Sea, very close to one of the Chinese reefs. Yes. And there was a flurry, there was bitter language came out of the official Chinese party media organs and so on, but it calmed down. Now, something similar is probable, but unlike Obama, you have a different potential of momentum, right? Because of the style and the structure. So, in other words, it's at least a toss-up. Therefore, it should be taken seriously.
And how do you suggest investors kind of get this into their thinking in terms of asset allocation and markets, particularly the dollar, of course, but other asset markets as well?
I think it's going to be one of those background worries, and clearly very much affected by the news flow. Often market reactions are very ephemeral. We can see, for example, that if you think back 5-10 years, there must have been at least half a dozen quite serious provocations by North Korea, and each time the market reaction lasts a day or two, mainly in Asia-related securities, but sometimes more globally in the dollar or another risk indicators. So given that, I think it's reactive, and it's a reactive and event reactive. But I think that we would want to say that that the US dollar, which is normally, of course, the safe haven for any crisis, including historically crises which have had their origins in the United States itself, would not, I think, be a haven if the types of risks we've been discussing on this call were to loom, or even worse, materializing. I think that there would be downward pressure on the dollar and preference for other currencies, the obvious alternative safe haven of gold, and so on. So, but I think that especially with a strong dollar assumption out there, which our strategists are questioning, of course, but nevertheless, with the US tightening cycle very much anticipated, that this is a consideration, this set of geopolitical risks we've been discussing is a consideration to be weighed on the other side, and in positioning and in risk management is something which we think investors should very much have in mind.
And likewise, within the group, the TS Lombard group, the Lombard Street strategists today have de-risked some of the tactical trade recommendations on emerging markets, in particular by tightening up the stop loss on some of the trades, and within trusted sources as well. Larry Brainard and John Harrison have equally been de-risking the portfolios from a tactical point of view, driven largely by this escalating risk of political tension and who knows what after that.
Well, exactly right, and thanks for mentioning that, Nick. I just close, of course, that from our strategist point of view, they naturally, as strategists, look at risks more holistically. The economic risk coming from trade tensions between US and China, the particular contribution that our conversation here now is having is just highlighting those worrisome, to put it mildly, bolted on angles. If it were only a deflation and ultimately a recessionary threat from trade tensions, that would be already one thing. But you've got this potential geopolitical turbocharger, which of course is what our strategists are also having in mind, but they are recommending just lightening up on risk exposures.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Christopher. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining the call today. I hope we haven't scared you too much about these risks of potential military tension. We're highlighting them because we think they are material risks, and they're risks that, as investors, you should not ignore. You should be thinking about how they may affect the values of your portfolios. If you have further questions that we haven't addressed on the call, please email questions@tslombard.com, and we'll reply to those. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll look forward to you joining us on a future call.